Tanzania, one tribe still hunts giraffes using a weapon they carve entirely by hand. It barely needs to break the skin to kill, and that's the entire design. Something far more lethal than the arrow itself is already moving toward the heart before the animal even reacts. This is the Hadza bow and poison arrow, and how it actually kills is almost nothing like you'd expect. Field research, anthropology studies, and first-hand hunting accounts all converge on the same story: how this weapon really works, why it can drop an animal 20 times the size of the hunter holding it, and why, despite all of that lethality, it still cannot kill the single largest land animal on the continent. That last detail has a very specific, very strange explanation, and it's coming later in this video, so keep that one in the back of your mind. At first glance, the weapon itself looks almost laughably simple: a curved stick of wood, a length of string, a sliver of hammered metal, a smear of dark paste behind the tip. No scope, no gunpowder, no moving parts of any kind. And yet this exact object, built from things that grow wild around a salt lake in northern Tanzania, can still put down some of the most dangerous animals on the continent. To understand how something this basic does something this extreme, it helps to understand exactly who is holding it. The Hadza are a small population, somewhere between 1,000 and 1,300 people, living along the shores of Lake Eyasi at the bottom of the Great Rift Valley. They are one of the only societies left on Earth that still gets nearly all of its food the way every single human did for almost the entire history of the species, by hunting and gathering it using nothing but tools made by hand. No farms, no livestock, no stored grain waiting in a barn for winter. Just the bush, an encyclopedic knowledge of every plant and animal living in it, and a weapon that has to work every single time because there is no backup plan if it doesn't. Picture how that weapon gets built, piece by piece, the way a Hadza hunter actually builds one, using nothing but what the surrounding bush provides. The bow stave comes from a specific local hardwood, the Hadza call kongoroko, chosen because it bends under pressure without snapping and holds its tension for years at a time. The string isn't plant fiber. It's made from animal ligament, stretched, dried, and twisted until it has almost no give left in it at all. The arrows are cut from straight reeds, fletched with feathers plucked from guinea fowl, the same bird the Hadza hunt for food, so nothing about the process goes to waste. And the arrowhead isn't stone or bone, the way you might picture an ancient weapon working. It's metal. Hadza men collect scrap, often old nails, and cold forge them by hand, hammering the metal against a flat stone anvil with a small hammer until it tapers into a sharp point, with no furnace and no factory involved anywhere in the process. That head slots into a short foreshaft which fits into the main wooden shaft, designed so that if the tip sticks deep in an animal or snaps off mid-hunt, the rest of the arrow can still be recovered and reused. Every part of this object assumes that materials are scarce and nothing gets wasted, and every part of it can be rebuilt in the bush with nothing but a knife, a stone, and time. That alone should tell you how seriously this weapon is treated. Now picture actually using one. This isn't happening at a target range with a clean shot lined up. It's happening at first light, in dry grass still cold from the night, with sandals off so a careless step doesn't snap a twig, moving half bent through the brush for half a mile without a sound, because the animal being stalked can hear a misplaced footstep from 50 yards away. Every minute spent closing that distance is a minute the wind could shift, the grass could rustle wrong, or the animal could simply look up. The hunter gets close, far closer than almost any modern hunter would dare, because Hadza bows aren't built for long-range precision. They're built for raw stopping power at close quarters, somewhere between 25 and 50 yards, sometimes less. And when that string finally gets drawn back, it's against a weapon that researchers who actually tested Hadza bows out in the field measured at roughly 70 pounds of draw force, equal to around 70% of an average man's entire body weight, channeled through 2 fingers and a strip of dried animal tendon. Some earlier field observers measured Hadza bows pulling over 100 pounds. Either way, that's a brutal draw weight for a stick of wood and a tendon string, heavier than most modern hunting bows sold in stores today. Here's where the story should get satisfying, because all that raw power should translate into a devastating hit, the same way a thrown sling bullet or a fired bullet relies on sheer kinetic energy to do its damage. And the data backs that expectation up, right up until it doesn't. Scientists who studied Hadza archers competing at targets set 15, 30, and 50 meters out, the same distances actually used on real hunts, measured the arrows leaving the bow at roughly 148 feet per second, carrying about 37 joules of kinetic energy on impact. That number is respectable for a hand-built wooden bow. It is also nowhere close to what a firearm, or even a powerful thrown sling bullet can generate. If this were a weapon that depended on blunt force and raw energy transfer to kill, it would be seriously outmatched by almost anything built in the last few hundred years. And on paper, the range problem makes it worse, not better. Competitive archers shooting modern recurve bows are accurate out past 60 or 70 meters, and historical weapons like the English longbow were reportedly effective well over 200 meters away on a battlefield. Hadza bows top out around 50 meters of accurate range, and most real hunts happen far closer than that, sometimes within just a few body lengths of an animal that outweighs the hunter by a factor of 10 or more. Low energy, short range, forced close quarters contact with something that could gore, trample, or crush a person in a single move if the shot goes wrong. That should be the worst possible combination for hunting dangerous game. So why does it keep working, generation after generation, on animals that could easily kill the hunter holding it? Because the arrow was never actually the weapon. The arrow is just delivery. The real killer is riding behind the tip, in a thin smear of dark, sticky paste that most people would walk straight past without a second glance. Hadza men make this substance themselves, and the knowledge of exactly which plants to use, where to find them, and how to prepare them gets passed down the same way the archery itself does, through years of watching and doing rather than any formal lesson. The most commonly used source is the sap of a shrub called the desert rose, known locally as panjuco, also referred to by the name adenium. A second source comes from a seed-bearing plant called strophanthus, and occasionally a third poison gets traded in from neighboring groups whenever local supply runs short. As farmland and grazing land have steadily eaten into Hadza territory over the decades, access to the desert rose itself has gotten harder to come by, pushing some communities to lean more heavily on whichever poison plant still grows nearby. All three plants share the same active ingredient, a class of compound called cardiac glycosides, the exact same family of chemical found in foxglove and oleander, two of the most notoriously toxic ornamental garden plants on the planet. These compounds interfere directly with the electrical signaling that keeps a heart beating in rhythm. In small, controlled medical doses, related compounds are actually used to treat heart failure. In the concentration applied to a Hadza arrowhead, the effect runs in the opposite direction entirely, throwing the heart's rhythm into chaos until it simply stops pumping blood. Stay with that detail for a second, because it reframes everything that came before it. All of that draw force, all of that bow building skill, all of that careful stalking through dry grass, it isn't actually what kills the animal. It's only what gets the chemistry close enough to start working. This is why an animal hit by a Hadza arrow doesn't necessarily collapse on the spot, and in fact, it often doesn't. The wound itself can be shallow, sometimes barely deep enough to draw blood. But the moment that poison enters the bloodstream, a clock starts running that nothing can stop. Researchers studying the chemistry behind these plant poisons have estimated that death in large game can occur in as little as 20 minutes, though it can stretch into hours in the biggest animals. Hadza hunters know this completely, which is exactly why the hunt never actually ends at the moment the string is released. It ends in the tracking. After loosing an arrow into a giraffe, a kudu, or a zebra, a hunter will often wait, sometimes for hours, before following the trail of blood and disturbed earth, reading broken branches and pressed down grass the way someone else might read a street sign, until the poison finishes the job the arrow only started. One first-hand account from a journalist who hunted alongside a Hadza man described tracking a wounded giraffe for over an hour after the shot, the animal walking for miles while the poison slowly closed in. That's the entire trade-off built into this weapon. It doesn't need brute force because it has chemistry working on its side, and chemistry doesn't get tired, doesn't lose its grip, and doesn't need a second shot. And this is where that earlier loose thread finally ties off. This same poison, powerful enough to bring down a giraffe, an animal that can weigh well over a ton and stand taller than a basketball hoop, still cannot kill a fully grown elephant. The dose simply isn't strong enough relative to an animal that size, no matter how many times the hunter strikes. Hadza accounts describe a clear workaround for this exact gap. If hunters come across an elephant that died of natural causes, they will climb inside the carcass and harvest meat, fat, and organs from it over a fire. But they don't go out of their way to actually hunt elephants with the bow, because the weapon, as devastating as it is, has a hard ceiling built into its own chemistry. The Hadza have clearly understood exactly where that ceiling sits for a very long time, because they've never wasted an arrow trying to push past it. It's not limited to giraffes either. Depending on the season and whatever happens to be moving through the bush that week, Hadza hunters go after zebra, wildebeest, buffalo, kudu, eland, warthog, impala, dik-dik, hyrax, and birds, almost anything that walks, runs, or flies within range, with one notable exception: the Hadza will not touch snakes or reptiles, considering them off-limits regardless of hunger. They will, however, eat predators that most cultures avoid entirely, including lion and leopard, whenever the opportunity arises. And one of the strangest hunting traditions involves baboons specifically. A handful of times a year, groups of Hadza men will conduct coordinated night hunts, surrounding a troop of sleeping baboons and taking down as many as possible in a single encounter, a level of cooperative hunting almost never used on anything else, since most Hadza hunting is a solitary pursuit done alone, day after day. There's a cultural custom tied directly to this practice. In some Hadza communities, a young man isn't considered ready for marriage until he's killed 5 baboons, an unofficial rite of passage that says a lot about how seriously hunting skill gets valued in that society. There's also a rule that sounds on the surface like pure superstition, right up until the psychology behind it actually gets explained. If a Hadza hunter wounds an animal but it manages to escape before the poison finishes its work, the hunter will not speak that animal's name out loud. Not to a hunting partner, not back at camp, nobody says the word. The belief is that naming the wounded animal alerts it to the fact that it's being hunted, giving it the will and the strength to keep running and ultimately escape. Strip away the supernatural framing for a moment and look at what the rule actually accomplishes. It forces total focus. It keeps a hunter's mind locked onto the chase instead of narrating his own failure out loud. And it keeps everyone around him quiet and disciplined during the single most dangerous phase of the entire hunt, the long tracking of a wounded, possibly cornered, possibly furious animal that already knows something is wrong. Whether or not a spoken word carries any real power, the behavior it produces is exactly the behavior that keeps hunters alive, which might be the entire point of the custom in the first place, regardless of how it gets explained. None of this comes naturally at all, and that's precisely the entire point of how it's taught. A Hadza boy starts handling a small bow almost as soon as he can walk, practicing on birds, rodents, and whatever else moves near camp. For years, long before he's ever trusted with a full-sized, poison-tipped weapon. There's no formal lesson, and no instructor correcting his form from the sidelines. He learns by watching the men around him, by missing constantly, and by trying again the next morning, and the morning after that. By the time he's a teenager, the bow has stopped being a tool he picks up and become something closer to an extension of his own arm, the exact same pattern found in virtually every culture in history that built its survival around a single-hand weapon. Hours of practice every day, starting in early childhood, repeated for an entire lifetime. There's no shortcut to that level of mastery, and there never has been. So where does a weapon like this actually come from? Nobody can give an exact date, because wood, sinew, and plant-based poison all rot away within years, leaving almost no trace in the archaeological record. But indirect evidence still tells a deep story. Researchers analyzing residue on ancient hunting weapons from southern Africa have identified the chemical signatures of cardiac glycoside arrow poisons on artifacts roughly 1,000 years old, and broader evidence for poisoned projectile use across the African continent stretches back thousands of years further still. Genetic studies push the timeline back even further than the archaeology can reach. Analysis of Hadza DNA reveals some of the deepest, most distinct lineages found anywhere in modern humans, with researchers estimating that the ancestors of the Hadza diverged from other African hunter-gatherer populations somewhere in the range of 50 to 70,000 years ago, long before agriculture existed anywhere on the planet, and have remained remarkably isolated, genetically and culturally ever since. The language tells the same story from a different angle entirely. Hadza speak a language called Hadzane, built around sharp clicking consonants that sound, to an untrained ear, almost like an entirely different category of sound. For decades, linguists assumed this meant Hadzane was related to the click languages spoken across southern Africa by Khoisan peoples. Closer analysis has shown it isn't. Hadzane is what's called a language isolate, meaning it has no demonstrated relationship to any other language family on the planet. It either developed in total independence, or it's one of the last surviving fragments of something even older that the rest of the world's languages have long since lost entirely. Either way, this is one of the most ancient, continuously practiced human lifeways still in existence anywhere. A thread running back further than agriculture, further than written language, further than almost anything else still being actively done by living people today, and the bow and poison arrow sits right at the center of it. And the Hadza aren't even alone in arriving at this particular strategy. Give humanity a few thousand years and access to the right local plants or animals, and the same brutal idea keeps getting reinvented independently over and over on opposite sides of the planet. In the Kalahari Desert, sand hunters developed an entirely different poison, made not from a plant at all, but from the larvae of a specific beetle, ground into a slow-acting toxin that can take days to finish off large game, forcing hunters into multi-day tracking expeditions across open desert with little more than water and patience. On the other side of the world, deep in the Amazon rainforest, indigenous hunters developed curare, a poison extracted from vines and applied to darts fired from blowguns, which works by paralyzing muscles rather than stopping the heart, killing slowly enough that the meat stays usable instead of spoiling around the wound. 3 completely unconnected peoples, on 3 different continents, with 0 contact and 0 shared history, all converged on poisoned projectile weapons as the answer to the exact same problem. How do you take down an animal 5, 10, even 20 times your own body weight, using only what you can carry in your hands and what grows within walking distance of camp? It's one of the clearest examples in all of human history of convergent invention, proof that necessity really does push wildly different cultures towards strikingly similar solutions, again and again, without anyone ever comparing notes, separated by oceans and thousands of years, and arriving at almost the same chemistry-based answer regardless. But for all its lethality, this weapon was never built for war the way a sling or a sword once was. It was built for something arguably harder, doing it again tomorrow, and the day after that, for an entire lifetime, with nothing but what the land provides, and what bare hands can shape. There's no harvest stored away for winter, no granary, no livestock pen, no fallback plan if a hunt comes up empty. Every single day resets the clock completely. That's an enormous amount of pressure to place on one weapon, and the bow and poison arrow has carried that weight for, by some estimates, longer than almost any other tool still in active daily use anywhere on Earth, which makes what's happening to the Hadza right now sting that much harder. Their traditional hunting grounds have been steadily shrinking for decades, squeezed by expanding farmland, livestock grazing pressure from neighboring pastoralist groups, and the borders of conservation areas that, ironically, often restrict the very people who have coexisted with that ecosystem the longest. Researchers and advocacy organizations working directly with Hadza communities have been documenting this loss of land for years, watching the open bush that this entire way of life depends on shrink, year after year, into smaller and smaller pockets, the same way countless other indigenous hunting cultures have already watched theirs disappear before them. The uncomfortable truth is that a lifestyle this specialized, this dependent on open land and free movement, doesn't have much room left to retreat into. Some researchers studying hunter-gatherer societies worldwide have suggested that fully traditional, fully nomadic hunting of this kind may not survive many more generations anywhere on the planet, the Hadza included. If that turns out to be true, this isn't just the story of a weapon. It's a snapshot of something that took tens of thousands of years to build, being documented by the outside world right around the same time it may be disappearing for good. So no, the Hadza bow and poison arrow will never outvelocity a bullet, and on paper the raw kinetic energy it produces is genuinely unremarkable. But raw force was never the trick. The trick is patience, chemistry, and a level of tracking skill that borders on the supernatural, wrapped around a weapon refined over more generations than most tools ever get to see, passed from father to son through nothing but repetition, with no manual and no shortcut anywhere in the process. A weapon capable of putting a giraffe on the ground in under an hour that hunters are taught to build, name, and respect with the kind of seriousness most people reserve only for things that can end a life in seconds, because for the Hadza, it absolutely can. If a single afternoon's hunt with a piece of carved wood, a strip of animal tendon, and a smear of tree sap can humble an animal that size, it's worth asking what other primitive tools out there are actually a lot more terrifying and a lot more brilliant than they first appear and how many of them never made it into a single textbook. For anyone who wants this kind of deep dive into how ancient and indigenous weapons actually function, hitting the like button helps this reach more people who've never heard the real story behind them. Subscribing keeps the next breakdown from getting missed, and the comments are open for whichever primitive weapon deserves to be unpacked next, because after this one, none of them look quite as simple as they did before.